Why have African people, throughout history, often been seen as a threat? It's a question that digs deep into the fabric of global history, and one that's rarely addressed with the complexity it deserves. Let me make something clear. This video is not about stirring conflict or making any race feel less important. My goal is not to incite division, but to reflect on history's uncomfortable truths and examine why Africans and their descendants have been perceived this way. This is my personal analysis, and while no one can fully understand the mindset of those who've shaped these perceptions, I aim to highlight patterns, to ask tough questions, and to explore how these historical views continue to impact the lives of Afro-descended people today. This isn't about seeking sympathy or validation. It's about understanding how history has shaped our present reality. So, sit back, because this is African Myths Unveiled. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have a quick question for you. I know that many of you are tuning in from different parts of the world, all united by a love for African mythology. So, I'd love to reconnect. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'll be in the comment section engaging with you. And if you're enjoying the content, a like and subscription would mean the world to me. All right, let's get back to the video. It's often said that the truth has power, and for some, that power is terrifying. From the beginning of recorded time, Africa wasn't just a continent. It was a cradle, a birthplace, a starting point, the land where humanity took its first breath. But what happens when the world discovers that the people it has tried to devalue are actually its origin? This is where the fear begins. Long before the ships came, before the shackles, and before the lies were printed in textbooks, Africa was known, not just as a landmass, but as a beacon. The Nubians, the Kushites, the people of Kemet, builders of cities, keepers of time, masters of medicine and astronomy. Their knowledge wasn't tribal myth. It was written in stone, measured in monuments that still stand today, defying erosion and denial. And this terrified the world. Because when the first humans are black, when the first civilizations were African, when the mathematics, medicine, and philosophies that shaped the world were birthed by dark-skinned people beneath the equatorial sun, then everything that came after must reckon with that truth. To place Africa at the center of history is to rearrange the entire narrative of superiority. It means that those who claimed to discover the world were centuries behind. It means that the ones considered primitive were, in fact, the pioneers. And that flips the power dynamic. This idea that blackness is not at the margins of history, but at its very core, is threatening in a world built on hierarchy. Because if the origin is black, if the source is African, then dominance over Africa is not just about land or labor. It's about controlling the truth. Even ancient outsiders recognized this. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, described the Ethiopians as tall, strong, and wise, more advanced in some sciences than even the Greeks. Arab travelers spoke in awe of the wealth and order of African empires. Chinese sailors documented structured kingdoms with art, law, and spirituality. But soon, admiration turned to anxiety. Because the more the world saw, the more it feared what Africa represented. A power that did not come from the West, and a legacy that could not be rewritten without violence. So, the narrative had to be changed. Africans became savages, even as they carried the blueprint of civilization. Their gods were labeled pagan, their traditions called superstition. Their achievements were buried, sometimes literally, under museums and foreign flags. Because if the world acknowledged the truth of Africa's primacy, it would also have to acknowledge its debt. and that truth has always been a threat. So let's be clear. This is not just about history. It's about why the presence of African people continues to provoke anxiety in systems that were not built for us, but on top of us. It's about why the erasure of African excellence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The first chapter of this story isn't about victimhood. It's about origin. And that origin is not weak. It is not broken. It is powerful. And for centuries, the world has tried to silence power that doesn't ask permission. There's a reason why the black body has been both feared and fetishized, admired and controlled, weaponized and enslaved. From the sugar fields of the Caribbean to the cotton plantations of the American South, the African body was seen not just as a labor force, but as a threat wrapped in muscle, rhythm, and endurance. Let's talk about how physicality became political. In the eyes of colonizers, Africans were often described in contradictory terms. Strong but simple, resilient but mindless, powerful but controllable. These weren't just descriptions, they were tools of propaganda. By exaggerating African strength while denying African intellect, colonizers created a justification for exploitation. They're built for hard labor, they said. They feel less pain. They can endure more suffering. These lies didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were part of a global narrative designed to dehumanize Africans while simultaneously fearing what they could become if truly free. Because let's be honest, they didn't fear weakness. They feared what would happen if African strength was ever paired with self-determination. Think about how sports, music, and military service have been used throughout history. Black athletes dominate global arenas, but often face suspicion instead of celebration. Black soldiers fought wars for countries that refused to give them rights. Black musicians birthed the world's most influential genres, yet their voices were often stolen, diluted, or whitewashed. Even in triumph, African descendants have been viewed with a strange unease. Why? Because excellence without control is dangerous to systems of dominance. This fear of the black body isn't new. Ancient Roman texts describe the Nubians as fierce warriors. Arab historians marveled at the stamina of East African traders. European slave traders, while dehumanizing Africans, still wrote obsessively about their strength, their endurance, their ability to survive brutal conditions that would kill most men. That fear evolved into something deeper, the myth of the superhuman African. It's the same myth that says, black people are naturally good at sports. But behind that so-called compliment is a darker truth. It reduces complexity. It erases intellect. It dismisses emotional depth. And it reinforces control. It's the reason why when black men walk through certain neighborhoods, they are seen not as human, but as threat. It's why black women's bodies are policed, sexualized, and simultaneously deemed too strong to need help. It's why, across the world, the African body has become a battlefield, both literally and symbolically. Because a strong people, when conscious of their strength, become unstoppable. And for centuries, systems have been designed to ensure that African strength remains reactive, not revolutionary. But that's changing. From the diaspora to the continent, we are reclaiming the narrative, not just about our past, but our presence. Because the body is not just physical, it's cultural, it's spiritual, it's political. And when you understand that, you begin to see why the African body has always been seen not just as powerful, but as power itself. And power, uncontrolled, is what empires fear the most. When we think of oppression, we often imagine chains, whips, or guns. But some of the most devastating weapons used against African people were not physical. They were intellectual. Erasure, revision, rebranding. let's talk about how African knowledge became a battlefield and why remembering became an act of resistance. Long before European colonizers sailed to the continent, Africa had thriving centers of science, architecture, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. From the mathematical precision of the Great Zimbabwe ruins to the Dogon people's celestial knowledge of Sirius B, a star Western astronomers didn't discover until the 20th century. African civilizations were decoding the universe long before colonizers even had maps of it. And yet, in most classrooms today, Africa is introduced only at the point of slavery. Why? Because knowledge is power. And African knowledge posed a direct threat to colonial domination. It shattered the narrative that Africa was uncivilized. It challenged the myth that black people had no history before chains. So they burned libraries, they silenced griots, they outlawed languages, they criminalized spiritual systems. They erased names like Imhotep, an African polymath who predated Hippocrates by over 1,000 years and is considered the true father of medicine. They minimized Timbuktu, a city that housed over 700,000 manuscripts, covering medicine, mathematics, law, and theology, written in Arabic, Ajami, and local African scripts. They buried the fact that Kemet, or ancient Egypt, was not a European wonder, but a black civilization that influenced the world. Why go to such lengths? Because if the world ever recognized African intellectual authority, the very foundation of white supremacy would crack. You cannot claim superiority over a people whose ancestors invented surgery, algebra, metallurgy, irrigation, and cosmology, while yours were still trying to survive winters in wooden huts. You cannot enslave a people if their culture teaches that all things are connected, land, spirit, body, and time, and that life is sacred, not a commodity. You cannot colonize a land if its children know who they are and where they come from. So they made it illegal to teach enslaved Africans how to read. They rewrote textbooks. They labeled African spirituality as witchcraft and African science as superstition. They made sure our stories were told by them, for them. But the stories survived, in coded songs, in symbols, in oral traditions whispered between generations. Our knowledge was not lost, it was hidden, and now it's resurfacing. In the resurgence of African-centered education, in the global embrace of ancestral practices and herbal medicine, in the scholars, artists, and visionaries of the diaspora who are reclaiming truth. Because once you understand the genius that lies in African legacy, you begin to understand why it had to be silenced. And more importantly, you realize what happens when that silence is broken. There's a reason fear has followed African people wherever colonialism has landed, not because they were weak, but because they refused to stay broken. Across continents, across centuries, African resistance has terrified empires. Because every time the system tried to crush the African spirit, it rose, louder, stronger, unyielding. Let's talk about the historical fear of African rebellion and why that fear runs deep. When we think of rebellion, names like Nat Turner, Yaa Asantewaa, and Toussaint Louverture come to mind. But what many don't realize is how widespread and consistent African resistance truly was. On slave ships, captives jumped into the sea rather than be taken. In the Americas, they organized revolts, from the shores of Brazil to the fields of Haiti. In Africa, they built fortresses, devised codes, trained warriors, and defended their kingdoms with military strategy rivaling any empire. The Zulu nation under Shaka Zulu redefined warfare in southern Africa. The Kingdom of Dahomey had an all-female military unit, the Agojie, who struck fear into invading armies. The maroon communities of Jamaica and Suriname escaped into the mountains and jungles, establishing sovereign territories that colonial armies could never fully conquer. But here's the part the world rarely acknowledges. It wasn't just about fighting with weapons. Africans resisted through spiritual warfare, cultural preservation, and intellectual defiance. They coded messages in drum rhythms. They turned Christian hymns into liberation songs. They braided escape routes into children's hair. They hid deities inside Catholic saints, turning slavery into a battleground of belief. This resilience made African people unpredictable to oppressors. How do you enslave a people who believe their ancestors walk with them? How do you dominate a people who find meaning in struggle and power in memory? You can beat their bodies, but you can't silence their soul. You can burn their homes, but you can't erase their dreams. That terrified colonizers. Because at its core, white supremacy depends on submission, and African resistance proved something dangerous to the colonial order. You can be chained and still be free. Even today, that same spirit continues to challenge the status quo. From the streets of Ferguson to the protests in Lagos, from Johannesburg to Baltimore, there is a rhythm, a fire, a force that refuses to be extinguished. The unspoken fear in many institutions is that this force, this collective awakening, will inspire others to rebel, to question, to rise. And that is why African resistance has always been labeled as dangerous, radical, or violent, because it speaks a truth that makes the powerful tremble. Freedom is not granted, it is taken. And African people across the diaspora have always known how to take it. As we draw to the end of this exploration, it's time to ask, why in the 21st century does African identity still pose such a threat? The colonialists may have left, but the systems they built still linger, built on a foundation of exploitation, erasure, and fear. Today, in this globalized world, Africa remains a force to be reckoned with, not because of its natural resources alone, but because of the untapped potential of its people, its cultures, and its revolutionary spirit. African identity is more than just a geographical identity. It is a collective force that challenges the established world order. A force that refuses to be fully defined, categorized, or commodified. A force that knows its history, its roots, and its future. Let's talk about why this uncontainable spirit continues to pose a threat. First, let's take a step back to understand the continuing economic and cultural significance of Africa. Though Africa is home to the world's youngest population, vast natural resources, and rapidly growing economies, many African nations are still treated as exploited territories by global powers. Whether it's multinational corporations extracting oil in Nigeria, mining diamonds in Sierra Leone, or the plundering of African cultural artifacts and art, the control of Africa's wealth is still a dominant force in global politics. But the new Africa is resisting that extraction in ways unseen before. From Afrobeats shaking the global music scene to Pan-African movements challenging Western narratives in education, African culture is becoming the symbol of power in a modern context. The modern diaspora is reimagining what it means to be African, and the world is watching. African fashion, literature, film, and technology are no longer niche. They are now at the forefront of global influence. This is why Africa's authentic identity remains a threat. It represents something that powerful nations cannot easily control. It doesn't fit into Western ideals of conformity, uniformity, or capitalism. It stands for resilience, freedom, and a return to self. The more African people embrace their culture, from wearing traditional attire with pride, to using indigenous languages, to engaging in spiritual practices, the more they reveal a power that isn't bound by external borders or expectations. And this freedom of identity terrifies those who still wish to dominate. It threatens to unravel the fabric of a global system built on unequal hierarchies. The power of the black dollar is now being realized. The success of African entrepreneurs, content creators, and intellectuals continues to grow, and it forces the world to rethink its view on Africa. As African nations begin to claim their voice, their space, and their wealth on their own terms, the world will have no choice but to acknowledge the strength of African identity. The truth is, the more African identity thrives, the more it will challenge the narratives of superiority and subjugation that have governed the world for centuries. From activism in the streets to economic power in the marketplace, the African identity that was once viewed as a threat continues to rise, not to dominate others, but to assert its rightful place in a global conversation. It's an identity that embraces rather than rejects, and it's one that cannot be erased. As we've explored throughout this video, the historical perception of Africans as a threat is rooted in complex patterns of power, fear, and resistance. Whether it's the overwhelming legacy of Africa as humanity's cradle, the profound influence of its cultures and civilizations, or the fear of African identity's power and resilience, these perceptions have shaped the world we live in today. But here's the truth. Africa's story is far from one of mere victimhood. It is a story of strength, survival, and an unbreakable connection to the earth, to the people, and to the future. The perceptions of African people as a threat were never about weakness. They were about the fear of power, a power that still resonates today. The world cannot erase Africa's legacy, and as Africans continue to reclaim their place in the global narrative, we remind the world that Africa's strength, wisdom, and beauty are a force that will never be diminished. This is not just history. It is a living, breathing legacy that continues to shape our present and our future.